Hi, I'm Dr. Paul Louis Metzger, and I'm the director of New Wine, New Wineskins. Welcome to New Wine Tastings, where every week we'll have an opportunity to engage people from diverse backgrounds, all in the attempt to build relational bridges through Jesus in contemporary culture. We are desirous of the opportunity to engage in deep and meaningful ways, and we're really thrilled and excited to have you with us. Hello, this is Paul Louis Metzger, the director of New Wine, New Wineskins, and it's my privilege to interview today Pastor Jimmy Calhoun. We're going to be talking about Black History Month today, and I just want to share a few words by way of intro into my dear friend and brother's sojourn. Jimmy Calhoun is an author, ethicist, and a pastor at Bridging Austin, a reconciling community in Austin, Texas. Prior to entering the ministry, Jimmy was an internationally acclaimed musician, having been a member of Rare Earth, Parliament Funkadelic. How do you say that, Jimmy?
Funkadelic.
Funkadelic. Sorry about that.
There we go.
Parliament Funkadelic, the Buddy Miles Regiment, and the Dr. John Band. He is co-chair of Community Dreams, an Austin-based nonprofit serving urban youth, and the Austin Interfaith Inclusion Network serving the differently abled in the greater Austin area. I just love that language of differently abled, and it shows up in your new book too as well, that I hope you share a bit about. He is on the boards of the Interfaith Arts Council, Humanitarians in the Arts, the Pecan Street Association, and the Ex Nihilo Arts Center in Dead Man's Cay, the Bahamas. That's a bit of a whirlwind tour in terms of my friend's life and ministry sojourn. Jimmy, thank you, my friend, for joining us for this reflection on Black History Month today.
Thank you for having me.
So, Jimmy, what does Black History Month mean to you?
Well, several years ago, my friend Brian McLaren wrote a book called The Story We Find Ourselves In. And for me, Black History Month is more of a matter of remembering that we have a story that we're all living together. And for there to be a long-term benefit, we need to remember that each story is so different that they need to be highlighted as different between the Black community and the white community. And so we have to ask ourselves, in between those two polarities, what's the real story? What's the true story? And what's the story that we can grab and glom onto to move forward?
And with that emphasis on what is the real story, that's something that's been, a cause of joy for you. It's been a road, no doubt, filled with sorrows, trying to process that, trying to articulate that. I know, as we've talked about it in your writing projects, your teaching, your preaching, that's not an easy rhythm to find, is it, in terms of that that story? And as a jazz rock musician such as yourself, you're able to operate within different beats, different cadences and such, and bring them all together. But especially when we're talking about that racial journey, and you've written on this theme as far as how music can play a part, but that is a very difficult history to describe, to articulate, to invite people to join in and participate in. Do you want to share anything about that, and even some of your writings in that regard?
Yeah, sure. From a musical point of view or standpoint, let me explain how records were made, at least in the old days, before computer and digital. We would sit in the studio and record and try to knock out the parts all together. And then we would go into what was called a control booth. That was another area where there was great big speakers, and we would all sit around the control board, which was where the music actually was, the sound was combined. And we would sit there and listen to the parts. We listened back to the playback. And then we would listen for that part's no good, or you were too loud there. Oh, you slowed down. And so it was a process of re-examining what we had just played. And the story that we live in life we need to be able and willing to re-examine some of the things that we just recorded, that we just lived out, that we just thought. Some of our thought processes need to be considered, and that's a detached way of looking at things when you do it in the recording studio. For example, a friend of mine a couple of weeks ago, he was talking about the situation in South Africa. He's a musician of a band that everybody would know if I were to tell you his name, or the band's name anyway. And so he asked me, and he's white, I've known the guy since we were probably 14 years old. He asked me what I thought about the situation in South Africa where the land was being returned to the native people. And so he framed it, what do you think about the white farmers having their land taken away to give to Black South Africans? And he also framed it as white-owned land. And so that's a complex issue. For two reasons, we're both American and we don't really know the situation. But I put it back to him in a Socratic manner. I asked him how they came to own the land in the first place. And so the point and the moral I'm trying to make is that, you know, every story has a beginning, a starting point. And we all of us get caught up at a certain starting point. And they may not coincide and jive with each other. You know, some of us might be looking at the 1960s, the 1940s. They're talking about what race relationships were like in 1870. And depending on where you start is kind of where you end up and what you think is the most important aspect to be considered.
When you're a history buff or a historian when it comes to music, I mean, you draw from a variety of genres and over art history, music history. And I think so often when it comes to racial matters, we have amnesia. That's one of the reasons why it's so important for us to be concerned for Black History Month, because if we come in late to the ensemble or late to the concert, you know, we pick up and we end off not far down the line from where we started off. There's a sense in which we need to know, you know, look further back and reflect further back to actually have a bigger context for the life music that we're playing. At least that's in part what I hear from your reflections now and in other contexts. And so, like, okay, where did they get the land from? You know, where did they come to own the land? Because that wasn't part of your friend's wavelength, so to speak. He wasn't thinking about it. He needed to go back further, and it's very complex. It's very challenging for all of us, and we have to guard against, you know, historical amnesia when it comes to reflection on history and race, just like with music. Any thoughts further to that as we're riffing on that theme?
Not really. It's just it is very important to listen to the entire scale, because it's going to be in use at some point in time as you're composing the music the musical score that you're going to live by.
Thank you. So what is one or what are two painful historical events that you believe we should remember and why when it comes to Black history?
Well, in my mind, Black history and American history, which includes white history, begins and ends with slavery. There's really no getting around that aspect of our story, of our collective story. It was here when the country was founded, and it was here for hundreds of years as just an assumed way of the way the social order should be structured. And if we wanted to riff farther on the continuum of where we come in on any story, one of the guys in the church has a son, he's 12, 13, and he was at school this last school semester, and they had issued school books, textbooks. And in the textbook, it said that slavery in America was just a matter of Black people being forced to work without pay.
That's what it said.
That's what it said. That was that that that's what that young man would have walked away believing about that institution
Hmm.
had his parents not known me.
Hmm. So what did you share with them, or how did they speak to him about that?
Well, as far as my friends, what we talked to him about was just the history behind it, about not in a, let's see, I'm not really sure how to phrase this other than it was a lot more than forced labor. It was a matter of stripping away one group of people's right to their past story. There we go. To their history, to their story, and making it someone else's story forever. And it was going to remain that way, because once that was done, once that breach was done, there was no going back.
Hmm.
And so the story of the African in America was no longer the African story, nor was it the American story. It was a new story.
Hmm.
And it's a new story that is so complex and multifaceted that it's hard to, it's like a library unto itself, because depending on the geographic region here and people's attitudes, a lot of cause and effect stuff happen that don't reconcile with each other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you've spoken to, the big picture story, so to speak, the story of slavery, and how important it is for us to name it as it was, not a matter of that they were forced to work without being paid, but no, I mean, it was taking away their history, taking away in many respects, or at least attempting to take away their human identity and dignity, not something that can ultimately be taken away, but there was the attempt to do it, to treat them as less than human. And we've never quite owned that yet. Some people say we need to just move on, get over it, which I just feel like that doesn't help anything, and that's meaningless. We have to account for history. We need to move forward, but never by way of discounting or detaching ourselves. We have to own that. And America's history is a history of racialization. It's our present. We need to move forward, and we need to move forward together, but that doesn't mean forgetting about the past, but making sure that we don't repeat the mistakes and the sins and the grand evils of the past, but also celebrate great stories from the past that would live into the future as well. Before we get into that, would there be another particular story that you'd want to share about that stands out to you as a great burden, a great pain for all of us, but especially for the African American community in our history together in this country?
Well, it's been my hope and the intent of my life not to focus so much on events, on any singular event as to point to, because in my view, the pain and the things that the negative aspects of poor race relations actually happens to the millions and hundreds of thousands of people in our cities on a daily basis. So pointing to an event, a tragic event in Atlanta in 2009 or something that happened and it kind of misses the point in my view. To just a biblical example would be the Exodus. And when we teach the Exodus in our churches, the focal point is usually Moses and what Moses did, and the Israelites as a conglomerate or as an aggregate. But if you think about it, there's 600,000 or 3 million, whichever estimate you have of people that were together. There's all different variety, all this diversity within that tribe, living in unity and taking responsibility for each other and having to suffer with each other, all the things that are part and parcel of life. And for African people in America, they're sure, like when I was younger, church bombings were a big thing, and the fire hoses would make the news. But the reality for me was going to high school and hearing the stories about, from other people on my basketball team or people in my neighborhood getting fired for little or no reason, or getting stopped and harassed and beaten up. All those little things that don't make the news are the things that I point back to that should never be forgotten and should be highlighted, because they are part of the history, and they're part of the negative history. And I thought you made a great point. Johnny Mercer wrote a song about accentuating the positive. And as we get into race relations, we should accentuate the positive. And I'm glad for Black History Month that celebrates the great athletes or politicians or pastors or authors or scientists who made great contributions to the American story. But at the same time, accentuating the positive should never come at the expense of erasing the negative. That's where I've come to understand.
And I appreciate very much your emphasis on, let's not forget about the people in the midst of talking about the Moseses. And of course, there were these horrific events that even some of the great leaders of the past in the African American community faced, but they weren't alone. It was the community at large that also shared in that struggle just as much. And the leaders come from the people. Perhaps that's how you'd want to frame some of those, stories from the past that, are so positive, so inspiring, so impactful in a creative, constructive, energizing way, such a positive way, a mountaintop experience kind of way. What would, if you wanted to think big picture, what would that be? Would it be the civil rights movement? Would it be post-civil rights movement? What would you want to emphasize here if we're thinking about those accentuate the positive moments?
Well, accentuating the positive would just, I don't know that it would be the civil rights movement, in my view. I thought that gave us a little bit of a false sense of achievement. There was so much activity going on, and John Wooden said something very interesting. He was a basketball coach of some renown in the 60s, and his teams were, he was the coach of coaches, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Bill Walton, and they won 90 straight games, and he was not only a great coach, he was a great philosopher, and he said something, he said, never, ever mistake activity for achievement. Just because there's a lot of stories in the news and all these things are going on, that's not necessarily an indicator that things have really advanced to the level that that your eyes are telling you when you read the paper. Because as those laws were being passed in certain areas and access to education and those things were happening, the bands I was in, we were still traveling on the road, not able to stay in the hotel we were playing in, pulling up to a 7-Eleven and not being able to go in and buy a soda water or a drink or whatever it was, and being harassed and followed by the local sheriffs in the towns we were traveling through. So as all these gains were making national attention, on the ground, it was a snail's pace. So what I would say to accentuate the positive would not come from the aspect of what Blacks cause, but of some of the attitudes on the other side of the white acceptance and the understanding that there really was a problem. Not knowing how deep possibly the problem was, but at least finally being willing to be open to the idea that this seriously affects race relations, seriously affects millions of people on a daily basis.
One of the things I always find so fascinating about you, and you know, jazz always comes to mind, because with jazz, there's a kind of unpredictability. I mean, I don't know if you would agree with that, but there's kind of an unpredictability with jazz, and your responses are always like unpredictable. And I say that with great respect. You know, I didn't expect that. I didn't expect that, and I love that about you, because you always keep me on my toes, and everyone knows I need that, to be kept on my toes. And but I really find that striking. And you know, it is true, isn't it, that we so often in at least in my circles, you know, will say, well, we have the civil rights movement, right? I mean, there's no longer segregation. There's no longer, you know, this, you know, problem with different drinking fountains and all that type of stuff. So we're past it. And, you know, even if some of those legal issues have been accounted for, the mindsets, the heart sets, the going into the 7-Elevens, whether it's a literal 7-Eleven or just an ideological subconscious 7-Eleven, is such an issue for us all even today. And you and I have talked about this, and it was really influential for me as I was working on my own social ethics book, that, you know, you said the social segregation, not the legal segregation, but the social segregation is something that is just so hard to get past. And I think where people are willing, you know, on a more positive note, to say, you know what, there's more here than we think. There is more segregation than we realize, and being willing to take a step forward and risk as not simply as an African American, but as an, you know, an Anglo American or as a white person, that's a step forward. And I hear you saying that that is something you'd want to celebrate and do celebrate. So, you know, what are your most pressing hopes and aspirations for the Black future and our future? Because as you're saying, this is not just one people's future. It's a future that's intertwined with others. Again, with music has so many influences in any particular form, whether rock, jazz, etc. There are all kinds of forms influencing it. It's a shared story. But what are some of your hopes and aspirations, Jimmy?
Well, if we're going to continue along the jazz metaphor, there are. I think in my second book we talked about the fact there were only 11 or 12 notes, depending on how you count them, and they're arranged chromatically, and that means like you start with, let's say if you start with C, you go to D, you go to E, you go to F, you go to G. Each one of those notes is a little bit farther in distance from the starting point, and but yet they're able to be used to make, you know, some terrible music, but they're also able to use to make very harmonious and sweet sounds. And you know, there's always going to be spatial distance. People are going to, quote, discriminate, and I used to not like that word because we discriminate every day. I discriminated when I decided to put on the black jacket as opposed to the purple. But spatial distance, we need to be aware of why there's so much division and distance between people groups. And is it just natural, as we like to tell ourselves, or have we really had a hand in creating that divide in each of our cities, in each of our communities? There are books out about why do the black kids sit together in cafeteria, and we hold that up and say, well, yeah, well, there's proof. Everybody just feels more comfortable with people like them. And my pushback would be, well, why did you use the notes in that way? There's no reason why we would start with externals or visual to connote difference. There's a lot of other kinds of difference. Preferences in basketball team, preferences in what kind of food to eat. Left-handed, why not have all the left-handed people live on the south side of a city? You know, I kind of make light out of it, but we don't think it. We sometimes we get in a herd mentality, and we're so far down the road that we don't realize that we've actually made decisions that leave others out of a chance to fulfill their own destiny and their own life, and that there's nothing more than social segregation, because if people aren't intimate with each other, there's no trust.
Mm.
If they're not willing to be in this close proximity for a considerable amount of time, there's no understanding.
Mm.
And if we're not able to realize that we're torn apart from each other because of decisions we made, then sometimes I get a little bit frustrated because I want to go, come on, can't you see? All of these notes make beautiful music together and you're continually choosing the wrong note.
Mm.
But that's what we do. That's what we do with our records, don't we? That's why they don't all sell.
Mm. You know, as you're talking, I hope those who are watching, who'll be listening, are, you know, sensing just what I always sense from you, a beautiful heart and a beautiful mind. Not like the movie Beautiful Mind, but, you know, a little bit different than that. But I've always found the heartbeat of Pastor Jimmy Calhoun and his thought forms to be very inspirational to me. And just, again, thinking about these matters from a different angle than we're often in our herd mentalities accustomed to doing. And I would just like, as you know, we come to the close of this interview, to really highlight his written works. You know, he's a musician, he's a pastor in Austin, doing a lot of work in the community. I'm looking forward to seeing my friend in May there in Austin.
Yep.
And, you know, I just, even, you know, in his new book coming out with Cascade, with Whiffenstock, and just reflecting on ethics in a very robust manner. Words like, you know, differently abled being explored in terms of the disability community, race, all kinds of factors being accounted for. Could you speak a bit to what drives you in your writing, and also a little bit about this latest book that's coming out?
Okay, yeah. One of the things that we tried to accomplish in the last book, and the last book that is coming out, is to have a re-listen to the 10 words that God gave Moses, that we call the 10 Commandments. And there's, in my view, it corresponded to the 10 notes, or the 11 notes that we're able to use in a scale. And you know, when I use notes to make music, I never look at them as something to limit me or to cause frustration, or to, they're always something that I can use to make something exciting and new and fresh. And so what I tried to do in the book is say, let's look at this in a fresh way. You know, we've all, those of us who came up in the church or attending churches now, we've heard the 10 Commandments taught over and over, but typically there's 1, 2, 3 ways of looking at them. I tried to not just make a practical application of them for today, but also give us a sense of how they can be used to make a sweet sound to the ears and the hearts of people who are living today. And that includes the differently able and the Native community here. I try to touch on all of the people groups that are living on the margins, just of our society and here in America, to make us aware that those people are out there. And Paul, you know, I came up to Portland a few years ago, and I went to Richard Twist's powwow. And I remember sitting there, and there's a people group that I knew very little about. And I was watching the dancers go around, and one 7-8-year-old kid in full regalia was dancing around, and I was mesmerized. I couldn't take my eyes off of him. And what I was thinking was, where is he going to be in 30 years? What's his life going to be like? And those are the same thoughts I had when I entered the disability community. And I thought, these people have no friends, so I started becoming their friends. I didn't start serving. It's little things like that. And we talk about civil rights. It's my hope that the civil rights community or the civil rights movement would be replaced with maybe the civic responsibility movement, where we become responsible for each other, where we see it as Christians, it is our responsibility to care for each and every person that God created. And that's a two-way street. And that two-way street is the only way to close that spatial gap, that division, because you'll eventually have to pass yourselves, each other. Sorry.
Oh, nothing to be sorry about, my friend. With our time here, I just wanted to say that, you know, something that was true of Dr. King, I so appreciate in you as well. There's a radical or revolutionary empathy in how you process life and perceive life, and hope that we'll have opportunities in the future to do some of these new wine tastings interviews, because I could listen to you share all day long. And are there any closing thoughts for today's discussion, Pastor Jimmy?
Well, it's really my sincerest hope that the way we look at our culture, and I know that typically people say I'm naive, idealistic, and overly altruistic. And my pushback is there's really nothing wrong with being any one of those. And if there is something wrong with it, then I'll just have to be guilty and I'll take my punishment. But seeing the world in binaries where there's always an insider, outsider, right, wrong, for this guy, it drives me nuts because I see the world holistically. And I see the beauty in every single human being that God's created. And if I don't see it, the onus is on me to learn how to see it, not for them to change. And, you know, I was thinking earlier about binaries and binary opposition, and there's no better metaphor or picture than our political system. You know, right now, people perceive that we're at an all-time high of dissonance and anger and at each other's throats. And I was thinking, just imagine, what if Nancy Pelosi, let's see, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, and whoever else, let's see, Rudy Giuliani, they all had a meeting and they decided, you know what, I'm going to take back every bad thing I ever said about you. I'm going to stop thinking all those negative and stop making negative speeches about what you do. What we're going to do is we're going to sit down and we're going to not leave this room until we all take turns in getting one of our, and we're going to take turns. You get one, you get one, then you get one, then you get one. And they go around and around and keep doing that in circular fashion and never, ever, ever utter a negative comment about the other. See, I am a dreamer. I have a dream. And I have a dream that that's possible. And I know that it's possible because it happens in music. But can you conceive of a world where politicians actually let go of the need to win? Because eventually, every time there's a binary, the goal is not for it to become coherent, but to defeat the other. That's what happens in sports. That's what happens in politics. Unfortunately, it's what happens in race relations, but it doesn't happen in music. And it shouldn't happen in this, what we call the kingdom of God.
Thank you so much, Pastor Calhoun. I'm with Pastor Jimmy Calhoun, author, ethicist, and pastor in Austin, Texas, pastoring at Bridging Austin. Jimmy, what's the best way for people to find out more about your work, like your website,
Yeah,
etc.?
my website for now, we're just reworking it. So jimmycalhoun.com. That's
Jimmy Calhoun.
Jimi, like Hendrix, Calhoun, Calhoun.com.
And Jimi Hendrix said, you know, he asked the question, "Are you experienced?" And he then paused, and then he sang, "Well, I am." And, you know, I think he meant it maybe in a different way than what we're talking about, but I've always appreciated the experience that I get from interacting with you, Jimmy. And so thanks so much for your time today, for joining me for New Wine Tastings. This is Paul Louis Metzger, the director of New Wine, New Wineskins, and Pastor Jimmy Calhoun, Austin, Texas. Thank you for joining us.